Welcome, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening to learn about the Comox Valley Regional District's work on coastal flood mapping and the development of a coastal flood adaptation strategy. My name is Alana Mullally, and I'm the General Manager of Planning and Development Services with the Comox Valley Regional District. Before we get started tonight, and together with my team, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that the lands on which we meet this afternoon to host this session are the traditional unceded territory of the Comox First Nation, the traditional keepers of this land. Erica?
Hi, thanks, Alana. Hello, everyone. My name is Erica Crawford. I'm with Shift Collaborative, and I'll be helping to facilitate this session tonight, along with my colleague Tamsin Lyle from Ebwater. And we've been supporting the CVRD with phase 2 of the coastal flood adaptation work. And so we'll get to share more with you about that throughout the evening. I'm just noticing that a couple of people are asking already about the Zoom functions. So just hold on 1 second. I will get to a slide and kind of walk you through what we've got to work with here. We're in webinar format, so it's just a little bit different. And to put your mind at ease, there is no mute or video button because it's webinar, so it's a different format, so you don't have those functions. So don't worry, we can't hear you and we can't see you. We're all good. So I'll go to the next slide and just give us a little bit of an orientation to what we're going to go through tonight. So the objectives that we have are providing updates on phase 2 of this work that we've been doing with the CVRD, and also to share some key concepts and best practice approaches to planning for coastal flood risk. And I know I've heard from some of our colleagues at the CVRD that folks have been asking questions, a lot of really good, insightful questions, wondering about flood risk in this area. And just want to mention and name, of course, that there's this really huge event going on all around us right now, and actually the rains are falling as we speak. And so just want to acknowledge also that this is a very real issue for us, perhaps in ways that some of us haven't ever experienced before, and just to make space for that and to acknowledge that this is a really important topic, and we're really glad that you could all join us tonight to learn a little bit more about this. Hopefully what we'll be able to share with you tonight will help you to better understand it. There may be some feelings of concern, nervousness, fear, and just unknown around this. And so hopefully tonight will be helpful in terms of better understanding, and then that can help us to better assess our situations and move forward in constructive ways. So we hope that it will help with that tonight as well. Next slide, please. So we've got about an hour and a half here together. We'll just do a little bit of opening, and I'm going to turn to you in a moment so that we can learn a little bit about you and the folks who have joined on the call tonight. And then we're going to be hearing from Tamsin Lyle of Ebwater. And the first piece of the presentation is going to focus on coastal flood risk and some overview background about the project, the work that the CVRD has done up until this point, as well as just some basic information and walking you through a better understanding of coastal flood risk and how we sort of break that down so that this really big issue can be something that we can approach. And then we will be doing some live polling throughout the night. So we've got a couple of times that we will pause and turn to you and get some of your input. And then also time for Q&A. So I'll explain in just a moment how you can participate in that. So later in the session, Tamsin will then share about some of the tools that have been developed in this last phase of work, as well as sharing some ideas for actions as individuals, as local governments that we can take to address some of these issues. And the spoiler alert is there's lots and lots of ways that we can be managing our flood risk. And so Tamsin's going to share a little bit of that tonight. And then at the end, you'll hear from CVRD about the key next steps that they're looking at, and we'll wrap up at about 8 o'clock. So just a little bit of an orientation. As I mentioned, we're in webinar. Probably most people are familiar with just regular Zoom, and normally you'd be able to see everyone and have the options to turn on your video or your microphone. So you won't see that, and the display here hopefully mimics something like what your view looks like right now. What you do see is chat, which is probably something that's familiar to you. But something that's a little bit different here is that there's the Q&A function. And so I just wanted to describe that a little bit for people, because this will be really important if you have any questions that you want to ask directly of Tamsin. This is how you will do it. So if you do want to use the chat, you can do that just if there's general things you want to share, if there's any resources or things that you think would be useful for others on the call, you're welcome to share those in the chat and others will be able to see that. Another point is if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat to communicate that. And my colleague Liz Vossen is on the call and she will respond to you and give you help with any technical issues that you might have. So please know that's available if you need it. And then one thing I will ask is if you have questions, try to remember not to put them in the chat, but to go to this Q&A button. And that's the one at the bottom here that was just highlighted. And so you click on that, and then this box that's showing that says welcome to Q&A will pop up for you. And you can type in your question there. So you type it in. And also, if you don't want people to know who's asking the question, there's this little checkbox at the lower left. If you could hit the advance again, Tamsin. So that's where you type in your question. That's where you can check to be anonymous. If you don't want your name to be attached to the question or the comment, you can do that. And we've got a couple of people who will be managing the Q&A behind the scenes and then gathering those questions up to share with Tamsin. Or if there's any that are specific to the CVRD, Alana will also be available to answer those questions. And the other thing to let you know about is once a question is posted, other people can vote for that question. So rather than many people entering the same question, you can sort of see the questions that people are asking, and then you can vote for those. And that will help us to know which questions you're most interested in hearing about. So please do use that function. Once there's questions there, you can just give it a little thumbs up and it'll bump it up so that we know that you want us to answer those questions. We'll just be doing the Q&A a couple points through the evening. So at any point as the presentation is going on, please put your question in there, and that will help us to sort of organize and get some feedback along the way. And then we'll bring those questions forward. Depending how curious you all are and how many questions you've arrived with or that come up through the course of this, we may not be able to get to all of the questions tonight. So one thing we wanted to mention is anything that we don't get to, or that we do for that matter, we're going to put together a little list of Q&A questions and responses, and we'll share that out. We'll put that on the website after this in the next few days. We'll pull that together and share it there. That's also something to note if you are calling in. I don't think we have anyone on the phone. We did at first. For folks on the phone, for everyone, we won't have the option to hear you verbally as we do the Q&A. So for folks on the phone, that means you also can't type it in since you don't have that function. So if you do have any questions, please, you could direct them to Robin Holm, who is on, if you go to the website, she's the contact for this project. And maybe Robin, you can put your contact information in the chat for folks as well. And if you have any questions, please just send her an email and we'll include those in the Q&A as well. All right, I think that's about it for Zoom and getting you guys set up there. If you have any more questions, again, please put those in the chat and Liz will help you directly to address any of those. Next slide. All right. So some of you may be familiar with some of these live polling platforms. We're going to use one tonight that's called Menti.com. We're going to use this 3 times throughout the night. So as you pull this up, please keep it open on your phone or on your computer, whichever device you want to do that with. There's a few options for how you can connect with this. And what's going to happen is when you do, you'll go to this page and I'll share it in just a moment. And then you'll be able to answer some questions directly there. And we'll be able to see live what people are responding. So we're going to use that a few times. So I'm just going to put in the chat here the link. So that's the easiest thing. You can just click on the link. If you want to use your phone, you can just hold your camera up to this QR code and it will take you right there. Or you can type in menti.com, go to that website, and it will ask you for a code. And the code is 77336218. And maybe one of my colleagues can also just put that in the chat for folks to catch up with there. And I'm going to share my screen now and take us to the Menti poll, and we'll get started here with a few questions to find out a little bit more about folks who are on the call. All right, here we go. All right, so the first question, we'd love to hear a little bit about where you are coming from. So which community do you live in? And we have a few named here that we're familiar with from the flood mapping work that we've done. And so if you live in any of those areas specifically, you can let us know. And if you're coming from outside of the CVRD or elsewhere in the CVRD, use those options as well. We'll just wait a moment here while people kind of catch on and join in here. All right, so far we've got a handful of folks from a few of these locations along Comox Road and Dyke Road, Western Union Bay, Ships Point, Cape Plazo, one from Saratoga Beach so far, and one from Little River, and then a fair number coming from elsewhere in the CVRD or outside of the CVRD. All right, great. So you can continue to add your answers in there and just let us know if you have any other questions. And someone alert me if there's anything else. Oh, someone coming from Cumberland, I see. All right. Excellent. So the second question is, what do you value about living in a coastal region? We're talking about flood tonight, but when we talk about flood, we're really talking about how flood interacts with the things that matter to us. So we'd love to hear from folks. What do you value about living in a coastal region? Great, so I see some folks mentioning some of the wonderful outdoor activities that we have access to here: recreation, paddling, kayaking, beach access. A lot of people also mentioning aspects of the outdoors that they really value and appreciate: the estuary, fish, birds, beaches, the beauty, forest, the outdoors, the open expanse. So yeah, some of the qualities of living in a coastal area as well. Wonderful, the views, the sea life, the changing seascape. Yes. Yeah, so it's a dynamic and a changing environment that we live in here on the coast, and that's a part of the nature of living in this place and also what we value about it. And let's also hear from you. How important are these issues to you? These issues of climate change and issues of coastal flood risk. So there's a pull that dial across the 0 to 10 here. But how important are these issues to you in your life? Yeah, so we're seeing both of these are feeling quite important to people. And I'm curious if we'd asked this a few weeks ago, if the answers would have been any different. I think this is pretty poignant for folks at the moment. Great. All right. So yeah, climate change, very important, and coastal flood risk also very high up there as well. All right. And just curious people's experience and where you're coming from. So have you ever experienced flooding in your home or community? And the options range from minor flooding in your home or community to major flooding in your home or community, or if you haven't experienced this as well. So yeah, a few people having experienced flooding before. Most of that minor, but a handful also having experienced major flooding. And so you know something of what this is about. Yeah. All right. And of course, this isn't a new issue to this area. We've had floods over the years. So great. We've got quite a range of where people are coming from, and then quite a few who haven't experienced this at all. Welcome to everyone. All right, so I will stop sharing that. As I mentioned, please, you can keep that screen up. It'll be the easiest way to come back to it when we return and continue on with that. But for the moment, I'm going to pass it on to Tamsin Lyle, and she's going to walk us through coastal flood risk.
Good evening, everybody. So yeah, my name is Tamsin Lyle. I am here in Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. And I am principal engineer at a company called Ebwater Consulting here in Vancouver. And we work with communities across Canada to support them to mitigate their flood risk. And I am excited to have worked for the CVRD for the last few years now to help increase understanding of some of the challenges that we face when it comes to flooding that now I think everyone is much more aware of as we watch what's going on in our neighboring communities. So I'm going to start by sharing with you, as Erica mentioned at the outset, a brief overview of some of the work that has been done in the CVRD to provide a bit of context and where we're at. And then we'll dive into a bit of a 101 session on some of the many challenges and complexities that are associated with flooding and coastal flooding in particular. That will hopefully set us up to understand why this isn't a quick fix solution and why we all need to work together to have strategies that will mitigate our risk into the future. So at the very opening of this project, we were given goals, and these are the goals of the Comox Valley Regional District for their coastal flood adaptation strategy. Very high level goals: minimize risks and vulnerabilities and increase community resilience. Pretty straightforward, very solid basis from which to work with. But of course, it's not that simple. We can't have a simple goal. We need to be a little more structured about how we go about this. And so in terms of the work that we've been doing with the CVRD, we were trying to answer three key questions. The first one being, where do we need to act? So where are the areas that have the highest risk? Where are the things that we care about the most that are going to get damaged the most in the community? Secondly, what are the best things that we can possibly do in those communities to reduce risk and to ensure that people aren't experiencing some of the things that we're seeing elsewhere in the province today? And also being mindful that there aren't, infinite resources, and we can't just come in and solve this problem right away everywhere, that we need to be thoughtful in terms of where we act first and when we act, and making sure that we're using our resources well with the best available information at the time. So with these three questions in mind, the Comox Valley Regional District is working through a series of steps to better understand risk in the region. The first one being a hazard analysis. So that is understanding where the water is today, where that water might be under a big storm, and where that water will be in future with climate change. That work was done a couple of years ago. It was finished, wrapped up around March of this year. The second part of the project was really to understand and identify areas of high risk in the community. So to better understand where the things that we care about interact with those hazards. Thirdly, to understand what we can do in the face of these hazards to ensure that we reduce our risk and make our communities more resilient and ideally better all around, and really improve our communities. And then of course, into the future, all of this needs to be created in a way that it can be implemented by the Comox Valley Regional District, as well as other stakeholders and individuals like yourselves. So in terms of some key messages that we want to get across about coastal flood hazard, most of you, I noticed, live by the shoreline. You all, the Menti questions we asked, we heard a lot of responses related to beach views and kayaking. So I suspect that most of you are very aware of the rhythms of the ocean and how it works. But it is important to kind of break those things down so that we're able to sort of scope and understand our risk better in support of making better decisions to mitigate that risk. So we're dealing with coastal floods here. So what's really important is the scenario where we have a lot of water that's higher than normal that is going onshore. And the way that that is created is through a combination of lots of different things. And so you live on the ocean, you all know there's the natural rhythm of the tide, and we have a really good understanding of what this is. But then we also have storms that come in, and those storms bring them with them storm surge, which basically sucks up the ocean because the pressure is different. It also brings in winds and waves, which blow onto shore and raise the level of water, as well as bringing in a lot of power onto the shore. And then on top of that, we have sea level rise, which is shifting our baseline upwards. Also, the CVRD is sinking, so they kind of balance out a bit. I'll get into that a bit in a minute. But all of these things together create the coastal hazard. The thing is that coastal hazard isn't binary. It's not there or not there. It's much more complex than that. And a lot of the decisions that we've been making for the last 50 or 60 years have assumed it's a very sort of simple there or not there problem, when in fact, flood has a lot of different characters, depending on the storm event, depending on where you are. And so a few of the key characteristics that are important when we're thinking about how to mitigate for flood risk are things like depth. The depth of water matters. If you're in a home or your street is covered with what we call nuisance flooding or minor flooding, just a few centimeters of flooding, that is usually something that is a nuisance, and we can move on after the water has cleared. We can wade through it if we really need to. We can brush it out of our homes. If you get a little more water in your homes, 30, 40 centimeters of water, and some of you have experienced this, that can be relatively damaging because you're hitting your electrical sockets, you're hitting your drywall. And so there are going to be repairs that are required. And then the next level up is what we call severe flooding. You know, if you've got more than a meter, sometimes you're, second story of flooding. So we're seeing that like in the Sumas Prairie right now. There's a lot of depth, and that's really catastrophic and usually means a write-off of the infrastructure or the building that has got that wet. So it's important to consider that there are different gradations of the depth and severity of flooding. Another important thing when it relates to coastal flood hazards is that there's a temporal basis of this as well. So the tide goes up and down, and so you actually get some reprieve when you have a coastal flood every 5 or 6 hours, which actually enables you to do different things in terms of response. So the key message here is that flood hazards are really nuanced. They're not just there or not there. There's a lot of different aspects that are really important to consider. And so when we're mitigating for these flood risks and hazards, we need to make sure that we are using the right tool for the problem. Of course, all of that complexity, and there's many more characteristics that we didn't go into for this meeting, but are available in reporting for you if you're curious. All of those characteristics are based on the assumption that our climate is stationary. Our climate is not stationary. And so we are seeing sea levels rise globally and sea levels rise locally. We're also seeing increased storminess, sort of more angry weather. I think nobody's going to disbelieve me when I say that today. So we have this warmer, more angry weather that's creating larger storms, bigger waves, etc. And so their baseline is shifting. It's shifting upwards, which means the floodplain is also shifting inland. So there are areas that today would only see a storm or water very, very rarely in a very large storm, that in future may be wet on every high tide or at the king tide, the biggest tides of the year. And there are areas that are dry today that will experience occasional flooding into the future. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of uncertainty in the science around this. So we absolutely know that the climate is changing. We know that our global sea level rise scenarios are pretty good for the next 50 or 60 or 70 years. But when we downscale down to local information, there's a lot of uncertainty related to how many emissions we have, the models that we're using, how that's being downscaled locally. And so within the CVRD itself, there's over about a meter in terms of the range of projections of sea level, relative sea level rise out to the end of the century. And some of the scenarios actually add another whole meter to that. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, which is very challenging when you're trying to make decisions to mitigate risks. And so the key message is that we know we have sea level rise, we know it's uncertain. And so we need to make sure that any solutions that we're offering up are going to manage that uncertainty and be robust across lots of different futures. And so we need to just strive for options that work under all sorts of different futures. Now to my favorite message related to flood, and that is that it's not the water that's the problem. It's not the hazard. It's the fact that that water is interacting negatively with things we care about on the floodplain that matters. And one simple model to understand this is what we call the risk triangle, which you can see on the screen there, where the area inside the triangle is the risk. And we can increase the area of that triangle and we can decrease the area of the triangle. So increase our risk, reduce our risk. The triangle has three vertices. One is the hazard, the bad thing, in this case, the floodwaters. One is exposure. So those are like the 2D elements that are exposed to that water. So the areas and the things that are in those areas that get wet. And the third vertex relates to the vulnerability or susceptibility of those things being damaged. Some things can withstand being wet, other things really cannot. And so if we think about this triangle, we actually have a lot of levers that we can play with to both increase our risk and reduce our risk. However, risk is not as simple as a triangle, unfortunately. And I think as we have all experienced for the last 2 or so years with the COVID pandemic, we know that disaster is wicked and systemic. It affects all different parts of society and it affects them in different ways. And it's not just a simple, my building is wet. No, that building houses a family and that family has some contamination maybe. I don't know, there's a lot of different potential linkages and stories here. There's a lot of different things that will be affected. So risk has a lot of complexity within it. And those risks are not the same everywhere. They vary in space and in time. And this is a graphic that we've been using for decades, but I think I don't need to explain it anymore, but it sort of highlights the cascading impacts of floods. So for example, disruption, I won't use the example on the screen there, but if we're disrupting a highway with a flood, then all of our supply chains stop working across the country. So there's a lot of impacts, even for folks who aren't in the floodplain, who aren't wet. And there's also long-term impacts associated with mental health, for example. So floods aren't just important where it's flooding, floods are important everywhere around. And I think that message is so much easier to deliver than it has ever been before. So the key message here is that risk is what matters, not the hazard, not the water, but the things that we care about being damaged. And so we need to use risk as the basis for any decisions going forward and think about that and how we make our decisions as well. Our last key message here relates to the actions that you can take to mitigate your flood risk. And so I've taken advantage of the event that's happening right now and thrown up a graphic that we made last week to show how the dike has played a role in how the Sumas Prairie is flooding. So if you've been following the news, there was a dike breach And that created a lot of damages behind it. So dikes, for example, actually just shift the hazard around. They just move it from neighbor to neighbor, and when they breach, they fail catastrophically. So that is one of the challenges of infrastructure, is that it's designed to a standard, and when it fails catastrophically. And what we want to do as adaptation folks is really fail gracefully. And so when we think about the actions that we can take, some of them are graceful actions that we can take relate to how we build our buildings. And I'll get into some details when I get into the tools later on. But for example, if we build our homes up on fill to a flood, what we call the flood construction level, it actually creates problems of accessibility, for example. It creates problems of servicing, for example. And so we need to be mindful that the mitigation actions that we put in place, dikes, FCLs, whatever it may be, that they will impact us 365 days a year. Those dikes are disconnecting the folks in the Sumas Prairie from the Fraser River. Any coastal dikes that might go in would impede all of those views that were really important when we saw the Menti questions. So we just need to be aware that mitigation actions have consequences, and we need to be mindful of that when we're making choices to mitigate flood risk. So in summary, taking action on flood mitigation is an incredibly wicked, messy problem. This is not something that has one answer. This is a very nuanced problem with nuanced answers. And the solutions are not the same everywhere. And they need to vary spatially. They need to vary depending on who's making that choice and why they're making that choice. The type of flood is important in those decisions. The land use that's already in play is important. Jurisdiction's important. First Nation rights and title are important. And also the capacity of a mitigation solution to actually reduce your risk is important, as well as recognizing that whatever you do will have impacts 365 days a year. You need to consider all of those what we call externalities or co-benefits. And that's it for me, Erica. I'm passing it back, but I'll leave the slide up.
Thanks so much, Tamsin. So one thing just before we go into the next Menti poll, there's a question here that I think you can just clarify right now. Someone's asking, will you be discussing the rivers? This is what the immediate concern is here. So just wondering if you can speak to scope of this, this project and the other work.
Right, so this project is very much focused on the coast. And so that is the scope of this project and the scope of this presentation. However, some of the mitigation actions that we will present in the next round are equally applicable to riverine situations as well. So there's definitely some lessons learned if river is your problem.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen next. Again, we're going back to the menti.com to do this. And I'm just gonna grab the, no, maybe I can't now. I'm just gonna grab the link here. Maybe someone else can do that for me and help to put that in the chat, and I will share my screen and move us into the next question. So curious about people's knowledge so far about where you're living and the flood risk there. So just this first question, do you live in a floodplain? Yes, no, or don't know? All right. So looks like most people are saying, nope, I don't live in a floodplain. A few people do know that they live in a floodplain, and then quite a few people don't know, and that's not out of the ordinary. So in a national survey, only 6% of people actually knew that they lived in a floodplain. So this is definitely something that is people are becoming more and more aware of. And also part of the reason for that, Tamsin could elaborate on this, is just that our flood maps are actually, a lot of them are quite outdated, and so there isn't actually good information even available about whether we are in a floodplain or not. Tamsin, did you want to speak any more to that?
Yeah, I just like and reiterate what Erica's saying nationally in terms of the gap we have in readily accessible and up-to-date flood maps that consider climate change. Huge gap. However, you live in the CVRD, so or most of you did. So we'll jump into some of the resources that are available to you in a minute.
Great. Speaking of flood maps, curious if any of you had reviewed flood maps for your community prior to coming to this session. Oh, we've got some folks who were keen and they did their homework before coming. Excellent. And a lot who are also coming to this looking for that information. Great. So from the looks of it, you guys are unusual because, again, from that same study, 81% of people had not reviewed flood maps for their communities. So you guys are looking quite ahead of the game compared to the national average. So well done, congratulations. And so clearly folks have been thinking about this, wondering what impacts of coastal flood risk are you most concerned about at this time? What kinds of things are you wondering about? Are you worried about? Are you seeing impacted that is concerning to you? All right. Yeah, people, of course, concerned about the impacts to their own home, homes and property, sterilization of properties, well water, yes, as the levels rise, damage to their own residences. Yeah, so water, drinking water being a concern. Rising sea levels, erosion is definitely something in certain areas we're already seeing around the area as well that's affecting some really important places and important cultural assets, for example. The economic impacts, the property values, also the habitat, the impacts that this has for forage fish and others. Yeah, seeing folks wondering more about insurance. It's only recently that insurance is more widely available even, but now people are starting to wonder a bit more about whether that will be available in some of these areas. Housing and agriculture. Yeah, so we can see many, many things that people are concerned about, but definitely some recurring themes. Yeah, also the septic systems as well. Of course, that can be impacted and cause more widespread impacts during a flood as well. And then some of those spin-off impacts, transportation and so on. Great, thank you. And one more question. So with all of those impacts and all the things that we're concerned about, who do you feel is responsible for taking action to reduce the flood risk? All right, so wide range of opinions on this one, quite widespread. And seeing quite a few people saying governments, planners, engineers, property owners, and then all of the rest too. So business and industry, residents, emergency managers, yes. And then quite a few of you mentioning all of the above. And so all of you are right. Of course, this is an issue that affects us across society. And so there's a role for everyone in mitigating the risks of flooding. And also great to see that clearly the engineering solutions are not the only ones on people's minds. This, of course, crosses many different domains and there's many different types of actions we can be taking. So we'll hear more about that from Tamsin in just a bit. I'm going to turn to Robin Holm now from the CVRD, who's been watching your questions, and we're going to have a chance here to ask Tamsin some of the things that you've been raising. And if you have other questions, please continue to add them in the Q&A. We'll have some time here, and then we'll also have some time again at the closer to the end of the session. Robin?
Thank you. We received a question about how people can, think about protecting their property and preparing for flooding without necessarily defaulting to retreat or depopulating these areas that have been identified as having high risk or priority areas for mitigation. So yeah, what can property owners do to protect their asset?
Luckily, the next 15 minutes presentation is exactly, or in part, some answers to that. We've got a whole pile of resources for individual homeowners in the presentation to support individuals to take action. And some of them are really simple, but I don't want to give them away just yet.
Okay.
So I want to keep everybody engaged.
Okay, thanks, Tamsin. We do have a question that would be directed towards Alana, and it's really talking about hard armoring and how this has been proven to have, negative impacts on properties. And so the question is asking what is local government, what is the regional district doing?
Robin, thanks for that question. So since 2017, the Comox Valley Regional District has been a member of the BC Stewardship Centre's Green Shores Local Government Working Group. And that's a really big mouthful. But essentially what that is that our board, through our regional growth strategy and through our rural official community plan, has been supportive of looking at nature-based solutions rather than armoring. And as many of you on the call will know, armoring, or the hardening, that riprap, those seawalls, many of you will have seen how they perform in a storm. And Tamsin's certainly the one to talk about this, but during her introduction, she talked about the power of the water and that wave energy. So a lot of you will have that image of in your minds of those waves hitting those walls and growing to a height of 30, 40 feet. And so we know that in some situations, in many situations, those seawalls and hard armoring aren't doing us any favors, and we'd be better off looking at some more natural solutions. That's not to say do nothing. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but just at the policy level, know that that's where our minds are, and wanting to support property owners to find solutions, as Tamsin said, that are going to be the right solutions for their property, given all of the nuance and complexity of coastal flood.
Okay, thank you, Alana. Tamsin, I just see a question here that talks about the convergence of ocean water levels and river flows into the estuary, and how can these river flows be accommodated?
Yeah, so that's it. It even adds another whole layer of complexity when we're looking at estuarine areas, especially in places like the Comox Valley Regional District, where you're likely to have an event like we're seeing right now. I don't actually know. I keep hearing about your rain shadow and that you're not getting it hard, but you do on other occasions. So the scenarios are, it's relatively common that you're going to have a really big rainfall or a rain on snow event at the same time as you're having a coastal event, and those things are going to interact together. So the key again is really to understand what's going on in the estuary. And some of the work that was done as part of the phase 1 of this project explored a little bit that nuance for the Oyster River system. And so understand, again, all of the complexities and the nuance around the hazard and what that means. And then that helps us understand better what we can do. But the main message here is that, water is powerful. It will eventually work its way out and will cause probably, it will shift and move on its way down. And so again, all of that hardening will probably make the river a little bit angrier. And so we want to make sure that we're trying to look at a broader set of solutions, but recognizing that there is a place occasionally for structural solutions.
Thanks, Tamsin. And of course, this just another question just highlights the significance of this with Comox Road, Dyke Road, being a main connector to the town and Courtney. So just highlighting that, and obviously, what can the town do to prepare for this?
Right, exactly. So we're going to have challenges all the time, especially when we have those critical infrastructure and that infrastructure that's regionally important. And I mean, we've seen what happens when we lose nationally important connections. We lose all of our, ability to, get whatever it is you're trying to get off Amazon. And so it is important in some cases where we have critical infrastructure to use different risk tolerance and to use different solutions to ensure that these things will function into the future to the best of their abilities.
I'm just going to jump in here because, technology, we love it, and it's just kicked Robin out. So I'm going to, Erica, give me the thumbs up if we can go to one more question.
Yeah, we definitely have time. So I
Okay.
can also jump in. Let me know.
Great. So this person is just thinking about construction, and it has a construction project planned. And they are working with a professional, and that professional has assured them that floodplain considerations have been taken into account. And just being concerned that, is that the case? And maybe the question is, what have we done in the CVRD to make this information public so that folks who are working with consulting engineers, builders, et cetera, have this information? So maybe that's me if it's specific to the CVRD, but then I could ask Tamsin to weigh in on any, broader responses of professional engineers and geoscientists, for example. So here in the Comox Valley Regional District, all of the regulatory flood mapping, so all of the work that's been done to understand, as Tamsin was saying, where's the water going to go, how deep, etc., that is all publicly available. We want this information out there. We want professionals using it because we want to ensure that it's playing a role in building that community resilience. Another thing that I would say is that the province regulates or gives the local governments the ability to regulate new development in floodplains. And so we, through working with professional engineers and geoscientists, we incorporate all of the most recent science, the most up-to-date science into our review of building permit applications, for example. So I think if you are working with that professional and they are, a professional engineer, professional geoscientist, you can have some confidence that they know what's what if they're working with you on a coastal flood. But really important to be asking those questions and getting this information here tonight. Tamsin, anything you'd like to respond with?
Yeah, absolutely. So EGBC has guidelines in place. And so if a professional engineer is stamping anything, they should be aware of what they need to do. And the first thing they need to do is go and look for the maps and the information that the CVRD has. They will also need to do a localized study if you're looking at flood construction levels. Because the regional information supports a regional understanding, and the coastline is very nuanced and messy. And so you will likely have to have a professional engineer do their own calculation at the site to make sure that it is locally correct. And you're considering things like those seawalls, if there's any hardening, what that means in terms of localized water levels. But you should hope that your engineer is looking at these things, and they should be providing you with what's called a letter of assurance to say that they have done these things.
One more technical question here, Tamsin, just to check this one off. Someone's asking, have you considered the raising of the land related to isostatic rebound? You kind of alluded to that, so if you could complete that.
Yeah, so we have, well, we didn't do this work. It was done by the previous consultant, Kerwood Liddell. Yes, so we're not looking at just sea level rise. What we look at is called relative sea level rise. So that's the expected rise in the water versus the sinking or rising of the land. And actually the CVRD is actually relatively well off in that game as compared to folks on the other side of the Georgia Strait, where things are playing out a little bit differently. And so the projections, the new projections, which are different than the projections, unfortunately, that Kerwood Liddell had access to when they made the original flood maps, suggest that sea level rise will be a little bit less than anticipated 2 or 3 years ago, and that less than what's in the current provincial guidelines for managing sea level rise.
Great. All right. We've got a couple other questions that have more to do with some of the strategies that can be taken to address this. So I think we'll hold on to those until after the next part of your presentation, Tamsin. And yeah, so maybe we can just move on to that, and we'll come back around and maybe spend a little bit more time on the Q&A after this next piece.
Sure, just gonna pop my
There we
screen
go.
back up here. There we go. So, right, so in terms of some of what I'm going to just sort of jump into now is some of the tools that we have developed, as well as the previous consultants have developed to support that understanding of risk, and then jump into some of the actions that individuals or local governments can take to reduce their flood risk. So Alana gave it all away. I had this, slide about all the cool things the CVRD was doing, but we'll get to that in a minute. But yes, there is available mapping for the Comox Valley Regional District. And coastlines are really hard to show on a graph or on a slide because it's so long and complicated and different. But the big story here is that it really depends on where you live in terms of how much flooding you might anticipate. And it's actually a pretty easy equation at the large scale. If the land is flat, you're going to see more flooding. If the land is steep, then obviously the water can't get up. And then there's a lot more nuance when you get down to the very local level, depending on the aspects, so which way the land is facing compared to those waves when they come in off the Georgia Strait, the actual slope of the bed of the beach area and the land itself. And so I encourage you all to go use the CVRD's new mapping tool. And maybe someone at the end can pop in the link to the site. It's not an easy link, so we'll pop it into the chat so everybody can see that. But you can now zoom around the Comox Valley Regional District. You can put in your postal code and find your home and see if it's in the regulatory floodplain. So this is a floodplain that shows a fairly significant event into the future. So it'll give you an indication of whether you are in the floodplain. However, we know that most of you already have the answer to that, much more than the average Canadian. So I commend you on that, as Erica did as well. But just to give you an idea of some of the additional information that's available in reports and maybe will be made, I won't say anything, I'll let Alana speak up later, but how this will be available to the public. But some of the other additional pieces of information that are available in the models that were used to support this mapping and the project that we did provide additional some of those nuances we were just talking about. It provides information on the depth of flooding, for example. And so I've just popped up Saratoga Beach, where apparently only one person lives. I should have chosen somewhere different. But Saratoga Beach is a good indication of what's going to happen today and in the future. And so on this map on the screen, you're seeing different depths of flooding. So if you reflect back on that slide I had way up at the beginning of the presentation with the different nuisance flooding. So that's kind of the yellow. And then we have the moderate flooding, that's the light blues, and then the dark blues are where we have the more severe flooding. And the way we've worked with this for the last year or so is divvy this up into different scenarios. So like a sort of a probable short-term scenario, a moderate scenario that should be used for medium range planning, and a more significant scenario that should be used for long-term planning with sea level rise. And I'm going to flick through them quickly so you can see what's happening with sea level rise and with different scenarios. So as you have bigger scenario or you have sea level rise, more areas are flooded and the water becomes deeper in the areas that were previously flooded. And again, one more kick at the can here, many more areas flooded and much deeper water, which has different impacts. So these are the kind of pieces of information that the CVRD currently has to support on decision making. The other thing that was a major part of the project that we just finished with the CVRD, or almost finished with the CVRD, was thinking about that risk triangle and trying to establish what are the things that we care about that are in the way of the water and how vulnerable are they to being wet. And so we conducted what's called a risk assessment And there's, a big long report that eventually will be available, but just quickly, what we did here is we looked at different indicators of flood risk. So we looked at things like people, we looked at economic and financial damages, we looked at potential damages to environmental and ecologically sensitive areas, which we heard in the Menti questions is really important. We looked at damages to cultural artifacts, sort of Comox First Nation areas, as well as other archaeologically important areas, and have mapped these all out. And each of these indicators give a really different story about what is important and where we should be focusing our areas, or our efforts rather. And so if we think about where water interacts most with people in the CVRD, places like Saratoga Beach, there's a lot of people who are in the way of the water. Currently, their homes are in the way of the water. Little River, for example. And then if you look to something like the financial implications of this, then the story switches a little bit and you start realizing that actually the estuary, for example, which is not in the CVRD, but in the municipalities, has a lot of financial risk associated with coastal flood. And so that you have to really be careful about what measures you're using when you're making decisions. And so part of the package of tools that we have developed for the CVRD is sort of a comprehensive list of things that we care about or that you care about, and where those are in space and how they are interacting with floodwaters. But now I'm going to jump to the fun stuff. So what can we do about this? Like, it's pretty overwhelming when we see these pictures and we see the news at the moment, and you look at all of that water and you think, what could we, the collective, we do, and then what can I do? And so luckily there's actually many things that we can be doing. And a lot of those things we're not currently doing are actually pretty easy fixes. So I'm actually I borrowed some slides. So Alana and Robin, you get a fresh pickup can here, something new to see, from another project that we have just finished, because I think the slides are really good. We had some help from a graphic designer on them. So going back to our risk triangle, there are things that we can do. There are 3 levers on that triangle to reduce our risk. And as I was saying earlier, we've been really focused on trying to stop the hazard. But there are 2 other levers. And the other thing is, and Alana alluded to this earlier, on the hazard side of things, we don't need to stop that water, but with that powerful water, what we really want to do is kind of take the edge off that water by having green shores, for example, that reduce the wave run up and reduce the big sprays. So there's some really sort of simple things we can do that are very effective in terms of reducing our hazards of power, and also are very effective across multiple climate scenarios, across multiple severities of flood. So we call these things, for example, land stewardship, or in your case, sort of coastal land stewardship. We can think about how we use our land, the exposure element, all of those things in 2D spaces. We can change the strategies that we have to try and mitigate, or like to avoid having critical infrastructure in the way of the water, like having the Comox Dike Road, for example, which is a very important artery. Maybe longer term, you could think about moving that or raising it. And then in terms of individual actions, there's a lot of things that can be done with regards to the buildings, how we build our structures so that they can get wet, occasionally get wet, but actually be very functional the rest of the time. And then we can recover really quickly afterwards. And I will provide a whole pile of resources and links in the next couple of slides here for that. But just to give you a few more examples of what we mean by land stewardship, it really is about recognizing that Mother Nature really has it down, and we need to think, for example, for the river areas, we need to think about what we're doing in the upper watersheds to try and slow that flow as it comes down. So when it meets the ocean, it's not meeting all of that water coming in on the coast, and we're taking the edge off our hazard. And the same thing is true for the coastal areas, where we can be applying green shores concepts, which allow the water to, not spray so high and to be sort of buffered by those natural green shores. And there's lots of great examples of that out there in the world. The other thing we can do, like I said, is those land use strategies. So we can think about how we're using our land differently. So the easiest thing we can do at this point is probably to avoid making our risk worse. So we can avoid putting lots of critical infrastructure or lots of new developments in the way of hazards. And so that was, part of some of the big recommendations we made to the CVRD are related to this in particular. And then of course, are the harder questions of the things that we can do related to retreat. So potentially over time in a very managed way, working with communities to take out the most vulnerable assets that are in the way of the water and move them back into a safer place. And there are a lot of examples of where this has happened across Canada or around the world, absolutely, especially in denser countries, but also in Canada. So for example, Grand Forks has a retreat program that's ongoing right now. I think we'll probably see some retreat out of some of the areas that have been flooded in the last few weeks here. So there are things that we can do at that land use scale. And this is kind of the more fun ones for folks who are actually living in the floodplain and wondering what they can do. There are a lot of things that we can do in our homes to make them more resilient from flooding. And this image here is one of my favorite books, but it's hard to get a copy of. So unfortunately you can't. But it's one of my favorite books. You can tell by all the stickies I got all over it, called Retrofitting for Flood Resilience. And so it just basically provides a whole book worth of examples of things that you can do to make your home more flood resilient. They're the simple things that you can be doing, like raising up your entire structure, but you don't have to raise up your entire structure. Why don't you think about raising just the things that you care about out of the water? So for example, those treasured items, the things that are most, financially expensive, for example, so not putting a media room on the ground floor, put that up on the second floor, for example. So there's a lot of things you can do in terms of elevation. There's also some tools that are available to keep individual building structures dry. So you can wrap them in various sort of building materials to try and stop the water coming into the building. There are some challenges associated with this because the buildings can pop out of the ground. But it is definitely a tool that's being used all around the world. And you can also make your building more recoverable from a flood event. So assume that the water is going to come in. We call this wet flood proofing. It'll be wet during a flood event, but afterwards it'll be quickly recoverable. And some examples of this are super simple, like not having hardwood floors, but having tiles. So after a flood event, you just wipe them down and you're good. Trying to raising up your electrical sockets up above the flood waters, which actually creates all of these amazing opportunities for accessibility, because all of a sudden things are easier. You don't have to bend over to plug things in anymore. And there's a lot of fantastic examples and resources. And if you go to YouTube and type in flood resilient building, you'll get all sorts of wonderful videos of folks, mostly from the UK, mostly retired of a certain age, who are going around their home and making small changes that have greatly increased or decreased their risk and increased their resilience. And on top of these sort of things that we can do to squish our triangle, there are things that we can do to make sure that we recover more quickly from a flood event. And these are things that are larger scale. So they're things related to actual response. So having good systems in place to know that there's a flood. I think we've all become much more aware of the importance of forecasts and warning systems in the last few weeks. Having those in place and knowing what to do when you hear that warning siren or that warning across the radio. There are things that we can do. We heard a fair few people talk about insurance on the chat and in the Menti polls. There are things that are available to help sort of make people financially whole after a flood. There was definitely an insurer in Canada who was offering coastal flood insurance a couple of years ago. I'd have to go back and check who it was and see if they are still offering that or if they've pulled out of the market, but there was certainly somebody who was offering it. And finally, a really important part of this is education and making sure that you who are on this call understand all of these issues, but also that other people who aren't here today get this information so that they can be supported to also make good decisions. And so just because I promised everybody some resources that you can go Google and look these up, so you can't click on our links. So I've just put a few on the screen here. I'm going to start you off by the middle of the screen there. Just Google it, you'll find it right away. There's a homeowner's guide to property flood resilience. And so this is the resource out of the UK. And it was championed by now Lady Mary Donow. She was knighted, who was a middle-aged woman, single mother, and she got flooded 3 times. And if you go online and Google her again, you'll see all these wonderful stories. She'll talk about the toilet paper in her home that came from somebody else's house because it was the wrong color. And she just describes the sort of horrendous experience of being flooded over and over. And she decided to act on it. And so she's been doing this for about 10 or 15 years, becoming a huge champion for what individuals can do in their own homes to act to reduce their flood risk. So she's easy to find, and this guide is really easy to find as well. And it provides really simple solutions. One of my favorite in this book relates to how heavy your furniture is on the ground floor. So if you know you're going to get flooded frequently, consider having light furniture so that when you get that warning, you can lift it up and move it upstairs. Super simple things. Another great resource, and or 2 resources that are quite similar, include the City of Brisbane Flood Resilient Homes Program. Again, Google it. So what's snapshotted on the screen there is actually an interactive view of a little house, and you can zoom around it in 3D and click on things, and it shows you all of the things that you should be doing in your home to make it more flood resilient. Simple things like the flooring that I've already described and where the outlets are, but also a few other, many other ideas related to appliances and how they're plumbed in and that kind of thing. The same thing is the case for the BRE, which is an insurance company in the UK, flood resilient repair homes. So this is actually a house that was built with the insurance company and a university, and they flood it. So it's an actual model house that is being tested over and over and over again to try and figure out what are the best materials to be building houses of that are in the floodplain, how should things be organized and designed. And so there's some great videos there as well to support that. And then if you have an engineer designing or a architect looking at work, there are some more sort of boring standard documents from FEMA, for example, which provides sort of much more detail around the material types and their specifications. Unfortunately, we do not have such a thing yet in Canada. There is definitely some talk about it now. I wonder why, or actually it has been in discussion for a few years with the National Research Council and the Standard Council of Canada. So I think we're a long way off having a simple guide like this for Canadians, but in the meantime, most of the ideas that you're going to find from elsewhere in the world are equally applicable here. The challenge is just sometimes getting some of the suppliers to actually provide the tools here in Canada. But I think the more of us that do it, although I don't live in a floodplain, obviously, the better off we'll be in terms of getting that supply into Canada. So lots of things that you can do. So hopefully everybody's made a note of that, and maybe we can get that in the chat as well. And then finally, another new slide for Robin and Anna. This is a bit of a plug for some work that Erica and I and another company, EcoPlan International, have been doing for the last 9 or so months in the Okanagan to develop what we're calling the Non-Structural Flood Mitigation Resource Guide for Local Governments. So this is a document that includes 40 actions that can be taken by local governments, or that local government can advocate for change to senior governments, or that they can support individuals to act on. And it's a resource that provides quite a lot of detail in terms of what each option is, whether it'll work for pluvial or fluvial or coastal floods, how deep the water, how effective it is for different depths of water is what I'm trying to say. What kind of land uses is this effective for? And what are some of the benefits and what are some of the disbenefits of these types of approaches? So costs, for example, are included in here. So this is it really is brand new. I think it was public 3 weeks ago on the RDCO website. So you can find that for actions that can be taken at a bit of a larger scale. So in closing, as a member of the public, there are sort of big things that you can do, and these are all based on actually an international framework called the Sendai framework. And the first thing that is really important before you act is to understand your risks. So start understanding some of the nuances of where you live. So are you in a floodplain? You now have an excellent resource for that if you're living in the CVRD on the coast. What kind of flood are you? Flood types might you experience? How often might you experience? How deep might it be? All of those pieces of information are important to know. It's also great to know what you've already done and how that might mitigate your risk. And also, have you looked into getting insurance, or do you have insurance to manage any risks that can't be managed otherwise, what we call residual risks? And then once you have that information, acting to reduce it by definitely advocating, and I would say better to support local governments on these issues, because they are challenged by funding models and the way the system works right now. But to support local governments to do the right thing and to recognize that it's not going to be a simple fix. So engaging with local government to help them make the best choice for your neighborhood, for example. You can do all of those small changes in your own home, are in those resources. I just threw this one in last minute here about the emergency kit, because I know how many people do not have them. And I think you look out the window, right, or look at your screen right now. This is the moment to think about doing it while you're not in an emergency, but you're aware that they happen. Lots of resources online for that. Prepared.bc.ca is a good place to start, or be prepared, I think. And then finally, one of the best, and I think we can see this if we look at all of the communities that are suffering under flood right now. We're hearing lots of heartwarming stories about how people have come together to support each other in the face of disaster. And I think the best way to enable that and to ensure that your neighbors and you are safe and your community is safe in the long term is to engage with that neighborhood before you're in a disaster, so that you know your neighbors, you know where the vulnerable people are, so that you can support them in a disaster, but better yet, support them to also make some of these small shifts so that they can reduce their risks. And that is it for me.
Ooh, thank you so much, Tamsin. We're actually, could we just go to the next slide? Because I'm going to come back to the Menti. I think we'll go straight to some Q&A here before we do that. We've got quite a few questions coming in. And Alana, I'm actually going to direct a couple to you first that have to do with things related to what the CVRD is up to. Give you a chance to have a breather here, Tamsin. So Alana, some folks asking about wondering how many people are attending tonight and maybe how many registered in total. And also, a question about your intentions for engagement and outreach to areas like Saratoga Beach, places that are being identified as being at flood risk. So if you could speak to that.
Great. Thanks, Erica. I think Ingrid, my buddy in digital land here, has just let me know that we had 234 folks register for tonight's session, and we saw 127 people log in at our peak. So, maybe sounds low given the severity or the broad interest, but I can tell you that for a local government evening session, this is a really great turnout. And then as far as what we're doing, I think, Erica, that was the second part of the question. What will we do to do some broader outreach beyond this session tonight? Mm-hmm. We do have a project webpage, and I know not everyone uses digital resources as their go-to. And that's where, if you know about those folks who do not use digital, help us get our message to them so that they can get the same kind of information that you're getting, and give us your suggestions. If you think that people want to receive this kind of information in a specific way, let us know. But in the absence of that feedback from you, what we do is put information on our webpage. Some of you might have read about this session in the newspaper. So we'll do advertisements. We sometimes do radio spots. And so we're going to be looking at myriad strategies to get that broad outreach, get into those areas where we really want people to have this information.
Great. And there's a couple of folks interested in what the CVRD is doing in partnership with others, because of course this is such a multi-jurisdictional issue. And so one of these questions has to do with anything that the CVRD or perhaps other local governments in the area might be doing around speaking with the forestry companies and looking at logging in the watersheds and how that affects flood risk. And then the other one is to do with conversations with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. And this person is citing the Ships Point Road access and Highway 19A. So thinking about the overlap there with Transportation Ministry and what might be happening or planned or hoped for there.
Thanks, Erica. So I guess what I would say, you might remember at the outset, Tamsin talked about this being sort of the next step, and that we've been working with Ebwater over the last couple of years. And a big part of our work earlier this year was working with partner agencies, so including the member municipalities, provincial ministries such as Ministry of Transportation, Island Health, all of the key organizations who have either as property owners or managers of public assets or deliverers of services to get them this information, right? Because it's really important from an asset management perspective, as well as emergency preparedness and community preparedness. So my colleague Robin, who's on the call, has done a lot of the heavy lifting on this project to ensure that we've shared data with those colleagues, with the province, and also with the federal government. So it's broadly available. The specific question about working with some of the private managed forest companies around their activities in the private managed forest, which many of you will know is a big swath of our land base here in the Comox Valley. Those are discussions that are perennial about managing our watersheds and the impact of deforestation and timber harvesting activities on our ability to manage water downstream. So yes, those conversations have been happening for years, and they continue. And Erica, I'm going to have to ask you a third part of that question, or no?
I think it was just two. I might have just elaborated a little.
Thank you.
Sorry for any confusion. All right, so I'll turn to Tamsin, and there's some questions here about flood construction levels. And so one person is asking about how those levels were arrived at, and is it possible for people to see what went into determining those, as they're different in different areas?
Right, I can answer the first question, and the second question will probably have to shoot back to Alana. But yeah, so the flood constructions level, so those regulatory flood maps were developed using lots of hydraulic models and tools. But basically what is done is that hydrodynamic models, so computer models, are developed to understand the sea state in the deep water off the coast. And that considers things like the tide and the storm surges. And then on top of that, the waves are modeled, and that run up is modeled for a bunch of different wind directions and wind speeds and all of these things. And then that is driven on shore at different points along the shoreline. So there are, I can't remember top of my head, but around 200 or 300 transects. It might have been more. So these are lines that are drawn along the shoreline to understand the local topography. And then all of that information from the computer models is sort of driven on to that specific shape to understand how the water level is going to behave along that particular line or reach of land. And so where you have shallower slopes, for example, the water tends to sort of just slosh up more gently, but the steeper your slope, the sort of harder it hits it and the higher it will go. So it's very dependent on the slope, the local slope. So there will be differences in the FCL. And like I said, I think earlier on, one of the other big parts is how that wind field, how the wind is driving against the shoreline will affect also sort of the power of the force that's able to drive up onto the shore. And so the maps that were developed used standard methodologies and models and tools, but basically they resolve or calculate a flood construction level at individual transects. And then there is a bit of interpolation between those transects. And so there is sometimes a reason to adjust the FCL because the transect that was drawn might not have hit exactly the geometry that's important to your particular property or a given person's property, or there might be a feature that's new that's not in the model. So if there's any hardening of the shore, for example, often that wouldn't be included in the model. So in terms of whether all of the detail and the muck is available to support usually another engineer to make a really good decision, I will hand that back over to Alana.
Thanks, Tamsin. And the answer is absolutely yes. Like we really want everyone to have this information, and for the professionals with whom you might be working to help you navigate some of these questions on your individual property, all of that data is available. And that's just a matter of them connecting with us so that we can get them all of the technical information that Tamsin's referencing.
All right.
Yeah, and I'll also just chime in too that Alana and I have been getting more interest from the public. And so we originally didn't include it because we thought that it might have been confusing to the public, but we're seeing now that there's an interest and a need. And so we're going to be making those, there's a series of an appendix, and we're going to be posting those on our website, and you'll be able to access that information. Essentially, that's the methodology and then all of the supporting work to support that mapping work and hopefully help you understand where we got those numbers from.
Great.
So stay tuned.
Yeah, this is all a very much evolving space, as well as you're probably getting the impression today. There's maps coming out, there's resources coming out. And in relation to that, Tamsin, there's a question here, and I'll let you just kind of riff off of this where you want to go with it. Someone's asking about, for property owners who are in the floodplain, saying, you know, of course, this is their largest family asset, and they want to know how to make their properties less vulnerable and more resilient without destroying the economic value of their property by going directly to retreat or to sterilizing those areas. And relatedly, are there grants or other assistance available for people who want to pursue building management? I know the answer to this, but let's hear it from you. In the absence of that, perhaps, if you have any suggestions for people about how to sort of advance access to building management options.
Right. So absolutely, there are a lot of things that you can do, and some of them are actually really low cost. And so I think the resources, and I don't know whether they got put in the chat, but the 4 resources, I will certainly, they did, okay. And maybe we can post them on the website as well. Those 4 resources are really, really great places to start, and they're really focused on what we call retrofitting. So it's not about a new, like when you have if you're building a new home, there are a lot of really easy fixes that are basically zero or marginal cost. But when you're retrofitting a home, obviously you need to make different choices. There are you can make some really big decisions and try and lift your home, but you can also make a lot of micro decisions that will definitely support resilience. Unfortunately, which Erica alluded to, I am unaware of any grants, especially in BC here. However, I think they might be coming. So for example, there are some granting programs and some tools, inspectors and these kind of things funded by insurance companies, because there's a benefit to them in Ontario. It's mostly focused on what we call pluvial or in-basement flooding, but there are programs in Ontario where you can get an inspector to your home who will say, hey, these are the things that need to happen in this home to make you more flood resilient. And there are grants to support some of these things. So that does exist in Ontario. And I think I'm sort of thinking about all the folks who are wet right now, but so they're kind of taking one for the team for us in a way, because I think I'm hoping that we'll see some of those programs for the insurance companies move out to the West Coast to support us. So there definitely are tools available. And it's something that I have been recommending to senior governments for several years now. I've written lots of reports saying big words that you may have seen in the news around this. And one of the things that we've been recommending is to develop granting programs to support individuals to take action, for example. So they don't exist today, as far as I know, in BC, but they do exist elsewhere in Canada and the world. And for example, the city of Brisbane example I popped up earlier, that is actually a program that includes granting to support individuals, because there's a recognition that you don't want everybody to retreat. And after a disaster, there's actually, there's benefit for having people in those homes. And so you want to support those communities. And so there's a benefit to governments and to all to to support individuals to take these small actions. And so I would hope that in the future, we're going to see resources and money.
Great, thank you, Tamsin. So we're coming up close to the end of our time, so I'm going to bring the Q&A to a close here, and we're going to hear a few closing remarks from the CVRD before we end the session. I just want to mention for any of the remaining questions, there's some, for example, that have to do with various policy tools that the CVRD has and would be considering, as well as some other more technical things, such as being able to access data or maps or things like this. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll include answers to these things in the Q&A, and we'll put that on the website so that you have access to that. So thank you so much for all of your really wonderful questions and for your attention for this whole time. And I will pass it back to Alana Mulally, who is going to speak to the next steps that the CVRD has planned.
Great, thanks very much, Erica. So we've got up on the screen here my colleague Robin's contact information. As I said, Robin's been doing most of the heavy lifting on this project internally, and so we are going to be taking the recommendations from Ebwater, the final report, through to our CVRD board in the new year, early in the new year, and we're going to start to talk to them about next steps. So I guess the message that I would like to leave with you is that this was about information. This was about introducing you to some of the detailed work that Ebwater and KWL, pardon me, have completed for us. So now we're armed with really, really good information, detailed information that is going to help our community make decisions about what we do. And certainly on this through this conversation, we've heard that there's no easy answer, and people are very, very invested in this emotionally, financially, etc. And so this is a beginning. So stay tuned for more to come on how we'll be using this information in our communities to move forward and build that broad community resilience. Robin, do you want to add anything?
Thanks, Alana. I think you've really just covered that really well, and really that's true. We're reporting back to the Electoral Area Services Committee with the strategy that is essentially a wrap up of this phase, a wrap up of Ebwater's recommendations to staff and to the CVRD. So I just would say that we will be posting that staff report and that strategy to our project website. So please return to that project website. We're also going to be including a recording from this session. If you know of folks who missed tonight's information session, that recording will be available, and that we're going to be posting essentially all of our next steps there. So you can feel free to reach out to me directly. You have my contact information, or just check on the project website, and you'll be able to see our updates there. And we really hope to be able to be reporting back on our next steps once we get some direction from our elected officials. Thank you so much for attending this session. We really appreciate you being so giving of your time and for the great questions. It really helps us. Thanks.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Alana. So we're at time, so you're welcome to trickle out now. If you do have a minute before you go, you can see on the screen here just one last question. We'd love to know how you heard about tonight's session. So if you still have Menti open, you could just let us know. And if you select other, you can also let us know in the chat here what that was. Really appreciate understanding that. So thank you all so much for your time. Thanks to everyone for your participation in the session tonight, and looking forward to the next steps with the CVRD.